Our second scripture lesson for today comes from the book of Micah, chapter 4. And you will find that on page 1444 in your pew Bible. It goes like this. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the names of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Amen. Please pray with me. Dear God, may these words from my mouth go into our hearts and be used by you. Amen. Well, today is a difficult time to be a pastor. It's a difficult time to be a church. Everybody in this room knows that last Sunday at the 11 a.m. service in Sutherland Springs, Texas, a man with a personal grievance against his ex-mother-in-law walked into a little Baptist church and murdered 26 people by methodically shooting men, women, and children in the head. Our minds can barely comprehend another instance of this sort of gruesome, intentional violence. We, for our own emotional survival, we're growing numb to it. There are just too many. We find ourselves turning off the television or moving on to the next internet story quickly. We can't adequately describe these events. We're out of terrible and horrific words. We've used them all up. They don't convey the depth of our pain anymore. Just the names of the places are now a shorthand for the gut-wrenching tragedies that have happened there. All you need to say is Las Vegas, New York, Sutherland Springs. Other places come to mind. Sandy Hook, Columbine, Orlando. And in the face of this horrendous list, we as Christians were kind of at a loss of what to do. This whole past week, my online clergy groups have been filled with people grieving for the innocent lives that have been lost. Grieving for our country's epidemic of gun violence, and grieving for our churches, because we now have to come up with security plans in order to keep some sorts of people out while simultaneously inviting everyone in. My friends, the era of church's carefree innocence is over. After last week's violence, even a church sanctuary is no longer considered a safe place in which to be. The very nature of the word sanctuary has been violated. The bad guys have walked in and spattered blood all over our most holy and sacred things. I really struggled with this sermon this week. But then when I thought about it, the church has always been about shedding of blood. We love to showcase our beautiful buildings with our lovely pews, our white robes. We love to present beautiful music, uplifting, happy messages. But the story we are compelled to tell is about God come to earth to be tortured, to be crucified. When we have communion, some of the words are about Christ's body being broken for us, Christ's blood being shed for us. And both the Old and the New Testament were written to people who were very familiar with bloodshed and public butchery. But we today are not at all used to any of that. We're suburban living civilians, and we live in a very sanitized world. But as I thought about it, I realized that it's not like that for all of us. For many of the veterans who served our country, they know what it actually looks like for someone to die in order to save someone else. They, sadly, are familiar with how much blood can come from a bullet wound. And yet, despite that, they had the courage to stand up for what they believed in, submit themselves to become a part of something bigger than just themselves. By being part of our armed service units, our veterans were, as a group, able to affect change in the world. And so today I wonder if we, as a church, would also have the courage to be able to help change the world by joining together. Now, the Presbyterian Church USA put out a statement this week, lamenting with the victims of the recent unprecedented number of murders. And they also quoted extensively from our denominational statement about gun control. They said this: the PCUSA and its predecessor bodies have addressed gun violence through the actions of many General Assemblies in the past 50 years. Beginning in the late 1960s, in response to the assassinations of public leaders, the General Assembly called for the control of sales and possessions of all kinds of firearms. Similar resolutions were passed again in 1976, 1988, 1990, 1991, 1996, 1998. Each resolution reflected a sense of moral urgency in response to the rising gun violence and the cultural trends that contributed to it. The 2012 and 2014 General Assemblies reiterated and intensified this call, urging the church at every level, local, regional, national, to participate in gun violence prevention, to provide pastoral and spiritual support to victims and survivors, and to engage in acts of public witness and policy advocacy, to enact stronger legislation to systemically address the complex causes and to work to reduce and eliminate the scourge of gun violence in our neighborhoods and in our nation. Their statement concluded by saying, "It is long past time for such a national conversation to commence. Too many lives have been shattered. Too few efforts have been made. And the laws that regulate gun acquisition, gun shops and shows, and the types of weapons available for persons intending violence are entirely inadequate. The time to reason together is now. The time to act is now." Now, before you think that the Presbyterian Church USA is against all gun ownership, that is absolutely not true. And nor is it historically accurate. Presbyterians were huge leaders in our War of Independence from England. In fact, the trouble in the American colonies was even sometimes referred to as that Presbyterian rebellion. And as they were working for our freedom from England, Presbyterians were not just using pitchforks and fists. They were using guns too. But just like everything else that Presbyterians did, gun ownership was done decently and in order. With all of that early Presbyterian influence in the establishment of our government, we should not be surprised that the Second Amendment to our Constitution uses the words, well-regulated. Now, any scholar of the Constitution cannot argue that the Second Amendment prohibits gun regulation, because the first portion of the text of the Second Amendment states that the right to bear arms coincides with the responsibility to be well-regulated and to part of a state-regulated militia. In the era in which the Second Amendment was written, if you owned a gun, you were required to train once a month on the village commons as part of the militia. The militia was the standing army. And if your commander found you of not good character or irresponsible, you could and would have that firearm taken away from you by your militia commander. And that would be reinforced by the local constable. The Second Amendment was not a license for everyone to own guns and to become their own vigilante or enforcer of their own interpretation of the law. The Second Amendment was about creating a system for guns to be regulated under military-level training and military-level discipline for the protection of the whole community. Now, I did not want to write this sermon today. I avoided this topic, but God kept bringing it back to me and telling me that there is no better day than Veterans Day to remind us that our military personnel are an important part of our ability to keep both our citizens and the rest of the world safe. And I can think of no better cause for our veterans than to take up and advocate for the well-regulated and safe use of firearms in our country. These are men and women who know firsthand how deadly those tools of war can be. And they are all trained and understand that it is a privilege to be issued a weapon. They do not imagine a world where everyone has to be armed in order to be safe. But because of the sacrifice that they gave, they all hope that the world will become more safe and more a place of peace. Now, our scripture lesson for today has this beautiful image of peace. Just imagine it. What would it be like for nations to no longer rise in wars against nations? Imagine a world where the headlines of bombings or terrorist attacks would no longer be in every one of our newspapers. Imagine where all people would be able to sit on their own land, raising their own food. Imagine a world where the people of South Korea will no longer be afraid of the people of North Korea. Imagine a world where Palestinians and Israelis live in peace and no longer fear each other. Imagine a world where there is no more market demand for steel to be made into gun barrels, but that all of that metal is formed instead into gardening tools. Now, there was one organization who believes that they are called to do just that. Shane Claiborne felt that he needed to do something dramatic to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the attacks on September 11th. Now, he and his friends were shocked to learn that some of the metal recovered from the World Trade Center site had been melted down and used to make a warship. They felt that was the wrong message to give. What they wanted to do was to take weapons and to turn them into instruments of peace. So they called their initiative Swords to Plows. And so they rounded up a welder and a blacksmith, and then they bought an AK-47. And they heated and cut off the barrel of the gun. And then on a blacksmithing forge with a hammer, they reformed that and turned that AK-47 into a rake and a shovel. Now, when word had gotten out that they had done this, they started to hear about other people's projects. They heard about how people had turned a machine gun into a saxophone. They heard about people who had taken melted handguns and turned them into guitars. They found out that many people before them had taken large donations of guns and had used them to create artwork, sculptures, art installations, all of them depicting peace. So these friends started to ask for donations of guns, and people started sending them to them to be turned into objects of peace. Recently, they turned a semi-automatic rifle, much like the one used in our recent massacres, into 3 different hand garden tools. That metal that was once designed to take multiple people's lives was now instead being used to plant vegetables that would feed people and give them life. This sort of thing is the call for all of us as Christians. We're called to take all of the gifts we have been given in this world and to use them to build a world of peace. We all need to work for a world in which the metal in our mountains would not be used to build more guns, but tools to bring abundant life to everyone. We're called to use our intelligence and our ingenuity not to build more clever bombs, more devastating ways to obliterate each other, but new ways to live in harmony, to get treatment for the broken, and to help keep dangerous things out of the hands of people who would misuse them. As the Church of Jesus Christ, we are not called to just sit in silence and just ponder on our personal joy of being saved by Jesus. But we should be willing to shed our own blood, sweat, and tears in order to save the lives of our neighbors in the world around us. Because, my friends, the example for doing that is Jesus Christ. And that is the example that we live by.